On the count of five, four, three, two, one. Hello and welcome to productlessons.com, our YouTube channel where we talk to product leaders from all over the world and learn from them how they build and manage world-class software products. You must subscribe to the channel to be notified for future episodes, and I can assure you there's an exciting lineup of product leaders in the coming days. And if you want only the audio format for consumption, you can use it from SoundCloud. The link is in the description. So let me talk about two exciting guests today that I have, and I'm thrilled to have them. And I'm having two guests at a time after a long time. They are Ben Foster and Rajesh Nerlikar, authors of this phenomenally insightful book that I am yet to finish. I am in the last chapters. Build What Matters. Ben is the Chief Product Officer at Whoop, spelled WHOOP, and founder at Prodify. Rajesh is the Chief Product Advisor Coach at Prodify. So Prodify is a common connection between both of them. They are both product veterans with impressive careers, and you must read the book to know how solid they are with products. So with that, let me just pull them onto the screen. Hey, Rajesh and Ben, welcome to productlessons.com. How are you guys doing today?
Hey, doing great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, Ravi, excited to be here.
The privilege is mine. Honor is mine. So, as I said, let's set the context. The book was, I would not have known you guys without the book. And thankfully, I read the book. It is deeply insightful. There are multiple books on product, but you found your place and you added so many deep insights and concepts and frameworks on product. But before we talk about details of the book, why don't you tell us what made you write the book? What triggered you write the book? That would be a great start.
Yeah, sure. So, like most authors, we wanted to share what we had learned. And the historical context here is that, Ben and I worked together a few years ago at a growth stage company out in Washington, D.C. that went public about 6 years ago. And we reconnected about 3 years ago to co-found Prodify, which is a product advisory and coaching firm. And in the last 6 years, we've collectively worked with about 70 SaaS companies, and we combined that with sort of our decades of own experience. And what we realized is that we were starting to see a lot of the same patterns in what product teams were struggling with that was preventing them from, building what matters. And so we, over the last few years, we got together, and last year we launched a framework that captured all of those best practices called Vision-Led Product Management. And then this year we decided that having a book to sort of like capture all the details and a lot more information and a lot more war stories about that framework and how to apply it and how it's helped some of the companies we've worked with would be really helpful just for the general product community. That there's no one is really going to school yet for product management, and so a lot of learning either happens on the job or through hearing other people and their experiences. And so we just wanted to share ours with the product community, or anyone who wears a product management hat. And there's a lot of people who will outside of like official product management titles. So that's kind of why we wrote the book.
Well, thank you that you wrote the book. Otherwise, a lot of knowledge remained with you guys without. Just with your clients, so the book you are reaching to a wider audience. So thanks for that. One of the interesting parts of the book was the 10 dysfunctions of product management, and the graphic has become very popular. I think it's also gone viral. I shared it on Twitter a few days ago. So please share with us the process of arriving at the 10 dysfunctions of product manager. Rajesh, you mentioned that with consulting so many clients, around 70 of them, you saw a pattern, and I think that's where it came from. But maybe you can delve a little deeper there.
Yeah, sure. I'll kind of jump in on telling a little bit more about the dysfunctions. It's probably appropriate since I've personally experienced all of them in my own direct work, as well as some of the advisory work that I've done through Prodify as well. So I think the interesting thing about the process of identifying these is, somebody else had previously asked us, how did you come up with 10? I could only sort of think of like maybe 3 or 4. And I think the reality is it was like we had about 40 to start with. And so we had to kind of, figure out how to whittle that list down to sort of like, just 10. And I think that's just because product management is so hard. There's so many ways in which you can fall into what I kind of consider to be traps. when it comes to product management. You can fall into the trap of being reactive in certain ways versus proactive. You can fall into the trap of, sometimes playing defense instead of playing offense, or sometimes like losing track of the things that matter most because there's just so many sort of like strains on your time. And so what we tried to do, Rajesh and I, was to catalog a lot of the kinds of issues that we had seen across different companies where, as an advisor, we were trying to help them to solve some sort of a particular problem. And then we tried to abstract those in such a way that we could sort of compare across companies. So whether it was a B2B enterprise company or a consumer mobile company, it didn't really matter. A lot of these same kinds of problems, if you think about them the right way, you start to see the patterns and you start to connect the dots between these companies and say, wow, that problem that I'm seeing over here is really the same kind of problem that I'm starting to see over here. And the patterns just in a lot of ways started to emerge. And so we kind of wanted to share those things that we had observed from these companies with readers in the book, and really kind of like started the whole book off with the top 10 dysfunctions of product, because I think it was a really good way to kind of like get people sort of to nod their head up and down and say, yeah, I'm very familiar with that myself. I've experienced those firsthand, and it kind of gives a little bit of a framework for the kinds of things that we're going to be able to help you solve if you kind of continue reading the book from there.
Got it. So let's, of course, I do not want to go deeper into all the 10 dysfunctions. I would incentivize that to the audience to buy the book and go through all the 10. But let's pick the favorite 3 of yours and just go a little deeper and try to understand what are your favorite 3 dysfunctions that you have seen as a recurring theme across all companies.
Sure. I'll start with, one, and like kind of in the same way that we whittled 40 down to 10. I'm thinking about sort of the most common ones, or the ones that are really holding teams back from building what matters. Honestly, I think that the one that really stands out for me is, we call it the counting house. It's basically an obsession over internal metrics. And if you buy into this concept of what gets measured gets managed, because people are just optimizing for the goals that they're that they're setting for themselves and their teams, then the challenge that we've seen with a lot of companies focusing on, ARR, MRR, and NPS and daily active users is, it's so easy to just lose sight of what the customers need behind the scenes. And like, this focus on your internal metrics means that it comes at the cost of spending time focusing on the metrics that your customers would care about and that they would use. And the reality is, all of those internal metrics are lagging indicators of whether your customers are finding value in your product. And so when we see teams saying, well, we need to 10x, we have a 20% revenue growth target for this year, and therefore our product roadmap looks like this, it's like, okay, that's great. But what are the things that your customers are going to be willing to pay you 10%, 20% more for this year? Or are you going to reach 20% more customers in the process and deliver value to them? And so I'd say that's probably the one I would pick. And then I know Ben probably has one, and then we'll figure it out.
Well, Rajesh, why don't you go ahead and take number 2 here, and then just don't steal the one that I want to use.
Okay. I think I know which one you're going to pick. So I think the second one that really stands out for me, that is the most common, and I think it's actually related to the first one, is what we call the ivory tower, which means that product management sits up like in this room or in their behind their Zoom calls by themselves, never talk to customers or users to understand how they think about the product, what's working, what's not, what does that competitive landscape look like, why did you even try our product in the first place, what were you doing beforehand, why did you leave us when you did leave us, like all those things that just come from, all those insights are necessary to make the right product decisions. And to be honest, I have a strong hypothesis on why this is the case that I found with working with a lot of teams when I say, have you talked to your customers or your users lately? And they're like, oh no, I don't have time. And so I think that there's a lot of sort of techniques that you could use, but I agree, it's hard. You have a lot of internal stakeholders, there's a lot of meetings, you've got sprints, like all those things are good and important, but I think about the leverage in your time, and it's like, if you have no input from those users except maybe like a data analytics report once in a while or something, how do you know what's really going on in their head, what they need, what they like, what's working, where they're headed in terms of their like business or personal lives and things like that. And so, I think this ivory tower one is another one that's tightly connected to measuring internal metrics and just kind of being obsessed with those things. It's just become so easy to focus on the people in your company, and you totally forget about the people outside your company for which your company exists, right? Your customers.
Yeah.
Before we
Oh, go ahead.
so before we move to the third one, so how do you answer product managers who say that they do not have time to talk to the customers?
Yeah, so I actually we have a talk that we kind of do about this, and I provide some sort of tactical advice. I think that the number one thing is thinking about what decisions you can delegate to your partners in tech and design. I think design in particular. So one of the things I often struggled with, kind of at a couple startups I was at, was you get consumed in daily stand up, and then there's always what I call the stand up after party, where someone's like, hey, I don't know what should happen when someone clicks on this button, and you're like, shoot, I totally forgot to think about that scenario. And then you spend 30 minutes with design and engineering to figure out what can we ship this sprint, or do we need to create another user story for next sprint. Well, what I realized after a while was I had sort of built decent relationships and good relationships with my designers, and we were usually on the same page about what the right answer was. And so what I started doing was I just said, you know what, why don't you, engineering and design, just like get together and think about what come up with a proposal, and just let me know what you think the right, kind of right next step would be in this situation. And what I found when I was doing that is, number one, I freed up 30 minutes a day for me to go think about something else. And two, that most of the time they came up with the same thing that I probably would have thought of if we did it. And so I think it also helps encourage and gives them, it's like an empowerment piece for them as well. It's like they feel like they're part of that decision-making process. And at the end of the day, like, some of those choices were not, they're not really big decisions that you need to be involved in every single decision. And I think that's the number one thing that I feel like a lot of product managers feel is like they just have to be part of everything. But I don't think that's true,
Ben, what's three? Number three.
All right. I'm going to choose one that is kind of like the opposite of the ivory tower in some sense. I mean, the ivory tower happens when product management kind of relies on its own title or its own role to say, because I'm the product manager, I'm allowed to just kind of like make a bunch of assumptions about the market and decide what we're going to go build, even if I haven't actually had the right discussions. I think the one that I'll choose is what we call the negotiating table. And I think it's almost like the other end of the spectrum. Where the product manager almost has like no agency in the process. And I see this kind of thing happen a lot because there's so many pressures, especially from internal stakeholders, sometimes from external stakeholders. It could be partners, it could be customers directly. Usually it's large scale customers, where marketing and engineering and sales and customer service and individual large accounts are all looking for the same kind of direction on the product roadmap. That the product manager can't possibly provide. Usually there's far excess of sort of like input and demands on product development than the product manager actually has capacity to do through the engineering team. And as a result of that, I think that they get so hung up on kind of like playing defense and trying to kind of like make everybody happy that in reality, what happens is they're almost like trying to make everybody least unhappy. And that's not the role of product, right? Like, the role of product is to set the direction and to set the course and to ensure that the product is going to be successful in the market over the long term. And instead, it ends up just sort of like being this balancing act of like, well, marketing had 2 features last quarter, so I want to make sure that sales gets at least 1 this quarter. And the reality is that's not necessarily the best way of building a product. You're kind of more focused on the operations of the business at that point, rather than saying, what is the role that I'm supposed to be playing as the product leader at this company? How do I set the stage for where I'm going? And I think that's just such an important thing that product provides. And it's just this trap that's very easy to fall into simply because of the mismatch of the demands on product development time and the capacity of product development available.
Got it. This is such an important point. In fact, one of my last blog posts was on that. And the challenge is it's easy for a product manager, for the rest of the organization to hate a product manager. Because most of the answers from a product manager to cross-functional organization is a no, right? Because they would all come to you with a list of their market requirements, customer requirements, and a product manager has to learn to say no. And on the contrary, he also has to manage relationships and he has to be a good people person. But this dichotomy is very confusing. And do you know how to resolve this? How can you say no to people and still be liked by them?
Sure. I mean, I think there's actually a couple of things that I would note on this. One of them is it is important to manage those relationships, but the key to managing a good relationship with stakeholders is not that you're willing to say yes to them. It's that you can get them rallied behind the direction that you believe is the right direction for the company and for the customer. And so I think that instead of falling into this sort of trap of saying, okay, how am I going to make you happy because you're requesting a bunch of things? How do I make it so that you don't even feel the need to request things from me because you're already aware of the direction that we want to head with product? You've been pulled into that process. You've had your input into that process. You understand the decisions that are being made on that front. And now that we're both sort of like aligned to this future direction that we want to go, we can both recognize simultaneously that anything else that kind of like comes along the way is almost like a distraction from the direction that we want to go in the first place. And I think that like that's real leadership. At the end of the day, I think what stakeholders are looking for from relationships with customer or with product managers is not people who are just willing to say yes to everything all the time. I think they want to get behind an idea for where the product can head and really, share that passion about the future kind of like direction of the company. So it's a responsibility of the product manager to provide that kind of thing rather than just sort of being like a yes man, whatever. And so collectively, ideally, I think a way of thinking about this for a product manager is not how do I deal with my need to be able to say no to them. How do I put them in the driver's seat so that they're also willing to say no on my behalf? And I think that that's a paradigm shift for a lot of product managers, but I think it's an important one so that you're not at the nexus of this sort of, disconnect between supply and demand for engineering time, but instead you're actually focused on getting everyone rallied around the same central idea.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, the thing I was going to add is I think that this is an opportunity for product managers to also rationalize why the answer is no, and that offers a chance to make sure that everyone is aligned on the priorities and why they are the priorities. And I don't think the answer is, oh, that's not on our roadmap, so we're not going to do it. Right. I think you have to rationalize why it's not on the roadmap and make sure that that stakeholder understands why it's not. And I think that becomes an opportunity to create more alignment on why the roadmap is what it is.
Right. Yeah. In some product cultures, I've seen the roadmap is like a black hole. Even though they tell the world what the roadmap is, they do not tell why the roadmap is the way it is. But radical transfer. I do not know why some product management teams feel protective about it and do not reveal it. But I personally feel that you can be radically transparent, because if you have good backing, solid backing to it, you should be able to rationalize it and explain it, isn't it? So great. My next question is also my favorite. This is about product-driven company, and in the last few months, I have heard this new term PLG, product-led growth. In fact, there are 5 different conferences on product-led growth, and it's all about product-driven actually. So you mentioned about product-driven very strongly. So what, according to you, is a product-driven organization, and what are the 5 traits of a product-driven company?
Yeah, maybe this is the thing that Rajesh and I can divide a little bit. Rajesh, I'll cover the sort of first tenets, I think, of being a product-driven company, and there's 2 kind of like key elements, I think, about what it means to be one. Number 1 is that you have to separate a product-driven company from a services-driven company. And I think it's really important to recognize the distinction between those 2 types of organizations and how they actually operate. So what I mean by that is a service-driven company almost like meets their customer first, and they identify what the requirements are for each individual customer, and then they find ways of saying yes to get to actually deliver what that customer is looking for. But that's where you're kind of like more of a consultancy, right? And you're delivering exactly the kinds of things that individual customers want. The problem with it is that it doesn't scale particularly well. And so product-driven companies really flip that on their head and turn the whole entire thing around and say, what I'm going to do is I'm first going to make the product available for a market, and I'm going to make it the right kind of product for a customer that I haven't yet met. And that's okay. But the right way to do that is I will understand who my customers are in the first place and the kinds of customers that I'm trying to reach. And then after I identify what that market is, then I'll kind of like intuit what the requirements are for that market, build a product that actually matches that particular need. And the best thing about that is that it scales because you're deploying the exact same solution to the next customer as well. So that's sort of like a fundamental kind of, distinction, I think, between the 2 types of companies. And when you break that down and try to understand what does that mean in terms of, the traits of being a product-driven company, it's probably better for Rajesh to kind of like go through that. But just the other, kind of tenet, I think, of a product management company or a product-driven company is that product decisions really come first and other decisions follow. So if you think about the operations of a company as like a machine where there are all these gears, there's always in a machine 1 gear that has the drive behind it. And product management, really a product driven company, should be the one that actually has that drive behind it. And the other gears kind of like mesh and work in concert with it. But you don't want to have drive coming from multiple gears, because then those gears are going to grind, at the same time. And so you have to kind of like choose one that's really going to be kind of like leading and the other ones to follow. And I think that's sort of like another sort of second tenet of overall being a product driven company.
And yeah, so then in the book, we kind of like get a little more tactical and say, okay, so then what are the 5 traits? How do I know if we're being a product-driven organization? And so the first one is really that product and UX are the closest ones to the customer. And that means that they're talking to them, understanding their needs, their motivations, what the existing solution space looks like. They just have a good sense of who these people are, what they're trying to accomplish, why it's important to them, why it's urgent, those things. And the reason that that's so important is trait number 2. As Ben mentioned, a product-driven company builds a single solution that serves the needs of many customers. Well, if you haven't talked to any of those customers and you have no idea what's common between them and what's different, and haven't clarified that this is the market we're going after, it's going to be really hard to build a single solution that meets the needs for many customers. And that's, the whole point of being product-driven is to build those like scalable businesses. And kind of related there, like, the third trait is that product-driven companies use technology to scale. Obviously, with SaaS businesses, that's clear from a user-facing perspective. But as the business, as you find product market fit, you end up in this like explosive growth stage from a business perspective. And that's the place where internal tooling, for example, becomes really important. So how do you scale all the manual operational tools? And like, just the quick kind of backstory here. When I joined Ben's team at Opower about 8 years ago, I think 9 years ago maybe, I was working on exactly this. How do we build internal tools to help us streamline our operations, improve our margins? And so, that's the third trait, is using technology to scale. The fourth trait is to understand how the market is shifting so that you can predict what the future direction should be of the product. So it's one thing to say, oh, I understand these people today, and therefore I'm going to build a product and meet those needs. However, product development takes time. And so, even if you assumed it's just a few months, if you don't have a good finger on the pulse of where these folks are headed and how their needs are evolving over the next few years, what in the B2B space, what regulatory trends are impacting these folks, what sort of like, broader market trends are impacting folks. As you set that sort of like vision for where the product should go, you may end up in the wrong place because there's a lag between what you're planning to work on now. And so I think this is a really important thing, is that you understand that how the market is shifting, so you can set that vision and make sure that your product is relevant by the time it hits the market. And then the last and fifth trait is just say no. As Ben mentioned, the difference between a product-driven company and a services-driven company is that the product-driven company has to say no because they're trying to focus on a specific part of the market and build the product that's right for them. As you say yes, you get this like kind of feature glob that keeps growing and growing, and pretty soon the product is so unusable that even your former raving fans are just like, I don't even know what happened to this product. I don't understand it. What happened to that thing I used to use? New customers get confused on how to get started, and it just becomes so unwieldy that it's no longer a great product for those folks. And so those are the 5 traits that we sort of use to express and measure how product-driven an organization is.
Thank you, Rajesh. Let's move on to the crux of your book, Vision-Led Product Management, and maybe you could shed some. How did this become the crux of your book, and what is Vision-Led Product Management?
Yeah, so kind of the backstory behind this, I'll get to the framework, but what we saw and felt ourselves in some of our own product experiences was like this shift towards from waterfall to agile meant that lots of product teams were constantly making small iterative changes to their product. And it became sort of their obsession was to continuously optimize the experience and run A/B tests and all those things. And that's great, but you'll never really iterate your way to innovative changes. And so, I felt this as well. Sometimes you pick your head up after 1 or 2 years and think about what's really changed in your product as you've been the product manager. And you're like, man, we haven't done anything game-changing or like groundbreaking in like 2 years. And so the reason we created the framework is to make sure that people never lost sight of what is a big picture, where are we trying to go with all of this? And so the concepts behind the vision-led framework are really like, number one, go pick metrics that matter to your customers. First and foremost, make sure you have a deep understanding of those. 2, then think about an experience or a customer journey vision for how you could like 10x that metric for your customers. We see a lot of product visions that are just like a bulleted list of features that need to be built, or a single sentence that kind of explains what the product should do and why. But what we focus on is how do you create a customer-centric vision that explains what their experience should look like, call it 2 or 3 years down the road. And then, the third step is to work backwards from that and say, okay, so if I did the gap analysis on what our product has today and what we would need to have in order for that vision to come to life, you probably identify like a handful of like giant features that need to be built, and that's effectively becomes your product strategy or your strategic roadmap multi-year, right? And then we have this roadmap balancing framework because we recognize that like most teams just can't dedicate 100% of their product development capacity to just building, towards that vision. They have to support existing customers. They have like, different operational needs to support the existing platform and product and things like that. And so that's kind of the core of the vision-led framework. And, why we think it matters so much is in the absence of a concrete documented vision, there exists confusion amongst the team on where we're headed and why we should say no to one thing but say yes to another thing, and that's where a lot of the swirl in product management happens. Is that there isn't a direction that everyone has seen, agreed with, and is sort of like building towards, and therefore these debates on what the high priority things are just are constantly happening. So that's kind of why we think it's so important, is that it's a leadership thing. It's just making sure that you can rally a team around a direction.
Got it. I would like to double tap on the vision piece there. So usually vision needs, of course, anybody can have a vision. It's a hypothesis when you begin, right? Of course, you see a market opportunity, but when the rubber meets the road, the vision might have to change because the feedback that you're getting from the market and the adoption and stuff like that, you might want to go back to the board and change things. So how do you see how strongly tethered you should be to the vision, and how loosely you should be coupled with the vision, and how often should you validate your vision and make changes?
Yeah. Rajesh, you want me to take this one?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. So, I've seen this situation quite a bit. And in fact, sometimes, just to even further emphasize your point, Ravi, I think that, we sometimes will get critiques from people in the agile community saying, I don't like this idea of setting forth a vision, way in the future about where our product should go or what the right kinds of, problems are that we want to solve for our customers, because of the reality that things are going to change so much between now and the time that we get there, that how can we possibly predict it? I mean, in many ways, that's sort of like the whole agile kind of like response to PRDs and things like that. And so why would you extend this concept? And the clarification that I think is important to make here is that the vision is not sort of something that's so, pie in the sky, kind of like direction that it's almost more like a mission statement. It's something that's sort of like a grounded statement about what the customer's experience really should be in using your product in the future. And that's not to say that you have every checkbox, listed and every button press and things like that. Obviously you want to have an ability to adapt and to learn and to validate as you go through. There's nothing sort of counter to agile about this. But I think that it's really important to have a destination in mind for where you're trying to go, because we all find ourselves in these situations. And, look, I'm sure that every product person who's listening to this would be familiar with this case, which is you have an idea for a product, you get an MVP version of it out there, and you get kind of like okay results, like kind of lackluster, but it's kind of indicative that maybe there's some interest here. And the big question is, how do you interpret that? Do you interpret that by saying, hey, the market has spoken, we've been able to validate that this is not exactly the right idea, and we need to pivot 100% away from it? Or is the fact that, you got these kind of like lackluster results an indication that you need to invest in it further? And I think that, sometimes that's like the heart of the matter. But to know the difference of whether you need to go one path or another path often comes back to this question of, is this critical? Is this like a necessary thing that we need to build to fulfill the vision that we've sort of like, put in place for how we know we want to, make a 10x outcome for our customers? And that often will answer your question. It's perfectly fine. And in fact, it's a very good idea to fail fast and pivot away from those things that are not necessarily specifically called out as part of your vision. But if they are something that's called out of your vision, then those are the places where you know that you need to persevere. To me, it's very similar to like, this, we've used this analogy before of like trying to navigate using Google Maps or using Waze, right? Like I think everybody would kind of agree that, when you're in heavy traffic and things like that, it's better to use Waze because it'll be adaptive and you'll learn about the traffic patterns and it'll kind of navigate you around the kind of roadblocks that exist. The problem is, imagine using Waze without ever putting a destination in mind, right? And if you never put a destination in there, then all Waze is going to do is it's going to navigate you away from traffic. And you may end up in a place that you never really intended to go. And in fact, it may be very much backwards. And so, I think that same kind of analogy really applies to product, which is you want to be advancing, and innovating and things like that on your customers' behalf. But if you don't have a destination in mind, you're not going to know how to interpret those results that you get along the way.
And how far out should the destination be? What's the timeline for a vision like? Should it be like a 2-year vision or a 5-year vision? What would an ideal, especially in the technology space changing so rapidly, what would be a good timeline for a vision to?
Yeah, I think you're right to call out the reality that it varies a little bit depending on the circumstances. So if you're in a slow moving industry, you might be willing to have a longer term vision. If you're in a fast moving industry, you probably need to make sure that you have, time periods where you can readjust your thoughts on that, on a regular kind of like cadence. Our general recommendation is that it's something in the kind of like 3+ year range. And I think that if you're in a startup, you might look at that and say, hey, that doesn't really apply to me. We need to get funding in the next 9 months. That's okay. That doesn't change the length of time that your vision is applicable. What it means is that you have milestones in your strategy that are more short term for how you go about getting to that vision. And if you think about the strategy as the set of milestones that you'll take between point A, where you are today, and point B, where you want to be in the future, you'll have milestones like, hey, we're going to have to get funding at this stage. What is it going to take for us to get funding? But making sure, again, that the kind of like nodes that are in your kind of like strategy along the way are actually leading towards the outcome that you want. So it doesn't mean that you kind of have to like ratchet your vision to be, super short. And I think sometimes that, companies make a mistake by trying to think that every element of their vision is something that they need to validate. And I actually really like the way that Marty Kagan describes this in his book, Inspired, which is to say, if you can validate everything about your vision, then it's really just an indication that you're not thinking in a bold enough fashion.
That's a good one. I just want to add one more question there. So who owns the vision? Of course, our audience here is product managers, maybe head of products or VP of product, but should the vision be owned by the VP of product, or is it a shared vision across the board with the CEO? Maybe if you can shed some light there, because usually when a VP of product joins an organization, the vision is already set. So we're talking about vision-led product management. So is this something that vision dictates all your strategies? That's why it is vision-led, or you actually participate actively in? So when you join an organization, you actually challenge it or maybe validate what the vision has been hand out to you.
Yeah, I'll start with a few thoughts, and I'm sure Ben might be able to add some more here. I think one thing to consider is that it depends on the company stage. And for a startup, there's no difference between the company vision and the product vision, because the company probably is centered around a single product anyways, right? However, at a later stage company, and exactly to your point, Ravi, by the time a VP of product maybe joins, there might be a difference between the company vision and the product vision, but obviously they need to be tightly connected. And I think the way I've seen this manifest itself most clearly is by the time you're a multi-product company, it means that you're probably serving many different like personas or markets. And I think the thing that the company needs to decide is whether our product vision and the product portfolio needs to move in lockstep, and there needs to be sort of like a relationship between all of our products and the direction that they're headed, or whether some of them might just, they really move in separate like kind of work streams or silos, and there's a reason for that. And I think it probably depends on like sort of how integrated your product suite is when a customer buys it and things like that. But that's the place where I think there is an importance for the VP to step in and say, well, we know that these are the things we're trying to accomplish as a company, which may be more financially focused, or like, or we may be thinking more about how do we like make progress on our mission. And therefore, how does our software like actually like affect that? And what are the really big things we need to be thinking about in terms of that long-term direction? And then how do I break that down into sort of like more strategic milestones? And I think The way I often talk about it, I think, is like, as you progress in your product career, the time horizon over which you're thinking is kind of what gets longer, right? As you start in the early stage, you're kind of thinking that like, how do I ship things in the next quarter that are going to be meaningful for users, and like kind of senior PMs and directors maybe kind of thinking at like 12, 18 months, and then you're getting into like 3-4 years as like VP and executives. And I think that's like one way I describe the difference of like who should really own this vision, and depends on the company. But I'm sure Ben has some additional thoughts.
No, I think you kind of nailed it there. I was busy taking mental notes on my side, Rajesh.
Cool. So in the book, you mentioned that to deliver customer value in the long run, you must choose a specific outcome, a key customer outcome. Could you help us elaborate that a bit? And what is a key customer outcome, and how do you identify it?
Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ben.
Oh yeah, I was just going to start with one quick note, and then I think you're totally right to take this on, because you're really the kind of mastermind of this whole notion, I think, of customer oriented metrics, which I think is really genius. But to just kind of like start with, and I would first try to answer the question why. Like, why is this so important? And I've seen this kind of thing firsthand. I think Rajesh and I have both seen this in some of our advisory work, where often when we're meeting with a company for the first time, we'll have that moment where we sit down with a founder and they'll go up to the whiteboard and they'll get really excited about all the future kind of direction that they're going to go, the metrics they're going to hit, et cetera. And they talk about, how they're going to revolutionize this industry, or how they're going to have their world domination plan and things like that. And, after 45 minutes of getting really excited, they'll kind of stop and say, what do you think? And I'll be like, what I think is, you never mentioned the word customer once, and you could have the most compelling idea and, clarify what the missing link is and all the other products that are out there serving customers today that you can sort of, solve. You can think about how you can apply technology like AI or, virtual reality and things like that to solving some sort of a new problem in a way that people haven't before. But the real question is not, what are you going to try to do to revolutionize an industry? Because that's the wrong orientation. Like, nobody revolutionizes an industry directly. You do that by solving a customer need so well that the industry will be changed forever. And it's more like that's the outcome, whether that's revolutionizing an industry, or whether that's hitting your own sort of like internal metrics. Like, I don't want to hear a vision that's like, we're going to get to $250 million of revenue, a year. Like, that's not a vision. That is the sort of like outcome. That's the side effect of you actually solving a customer problem so well. So the real question is not how much money are you going to make, what's your growth rate going to be, et cetera, but rather, how are you going to get the growth rates that you're looking for by solving customer needs in such a way that those kinds of things almost like happen for free. And so it kind of forces you to really think about things from a customer orientation. And I know Rajesh has a lot of really good thoughts on how to go about doing that as best as possible.
Yeah. And so, in the book, we kind of make the distinction in the framework as well, like, hey, there's a customer outcome, and then obviously there's business outcomes. And we actually think you need to be thinking about both. Obviously, there needs to be some connection, but the business outcomes are usually straightforward, right? For most companies, it's like maximizing shareholder value, which usually focuses on like, cash flow, revenue, but there might be some other assets like data or relationships that increase the value of a company. On the customer side, the key point here of why we start talking about this and call it a key outcome is that, as I was mentioning earlier, no individual customer cares at all about your ARR or your NPS or how many MAUs you have, right? All they care about is, did this product deliver value to me or help me accomplish something I care about in my life? And so I think the point of the key outcome is to get at the heart by asking the customers, what are they hoping to accomplish? And I'll talk a little bit about sort of how to do this, but I want to provide some examples before I kind of like dive super far into it. It's just like, for people on Twitter, like, you don't use Twitter just to like read posts. You use Twitter so that you can feel connected. You don't use Google Docs to like create documents. You do it so you can collaborate and end up with better business outcomes, right? With your colleagues or other people. And you don't use Salesforce just to track your sales pipeline. You do it to close more deals. And I think the point we're trying to make here with the word key is, yes, you have features and your product does things that users are interested in, but you need to get to the heart of why that thing matters to them. And so I think the process, we kind of talk about the 5 whys in the book, which is just ask why 5 times. Why is that feature important to you? Why is like, now the right time for you to be using that thing? And what you're really trying to get at the heart at is, what exactly are they trying to accomplish? Why is it important to them in their life? And why is there like urgency, or why is now the right time that they care about it? Um, and I think this is like, the 5 whys kind of gets at this, and this is why we talk so much about, doing the user research and making time to go do this, because if you don't get at the heart of what drives people and motivates them, then you'll lose sight of why it matters to them. And, Ben and I have worked with a lot of behavioral science folks in the way we build products. And one of the things I love is there's a prominent behavioral scientist, BJ Fogg, and he's got this model that talks about, your motivation and your ability to complete an action are that's what depends on whether you're actually going to take the action when a triggering moment comes in. And I think the cool thing he talks about is that motivation comes in waves. Sometimes on January 1st, everyone's excited about their health and go to the gym and stuff like that. But then by February 1st, it wanes. And I think this is another important thing to think about as you try to identify these key outcomes, which is like, is this going to be important for a long time, or is there a short window where this is relevant to these people and why they care about it?
Got it. So I completely understand the point of customer outcome. One of the things that I realized late in my product career is a product is not the product. The business model is the product. Say, so you might have a great customer outcome. The customer is happy, but if you do not have the requisite business outcomes, then your business might fail. One of my favorite examples is Evernote. For long, Evernote was a great product, but they never could monetize it. It did not have a business model around it. So is it something that the customer outcome, which is a great product, supersedes the business outcome, or they both go hand in hand and in tandem?
Yeah, I think there's a tight relationship, right? And what we talk about is, if you're going to optimize for the customer metric, as long as you have reasonable pricing and packaging and a business model to support your business, then you should be fine. And this is the relationship. That leading indicator is whether you're delivering value to your customer. The lagging indicator is whether they're willing to pay for it, and how much money they're willing to pay for it, right? But pricing and packaging is kind of the connection between there. In fact, Ben and I guess it's been 2 years now, Ben, we sort of created a modification on the product market fit concept, and we added sort of like economics in as the third bucket there, which is like, to your point, you might say, well, Evernote, everyone loved Evernote. It was a problem worth solving. They had a great solution for note taking and things like that. But they never built a business because they couldn't figure out how to quite monetize and build it profitably.
You also mentioned something about the outcome pyramid. Maybe you can shed some light there.
Yeah, sure. So yes, we introduced this concept of outcome pyramids, and the general idea is that you break that key outcome down into its constituent parts, maybe like a math equation almost, which is like, hey, the standard example we would provide in a B2B context, the key outcome is really the ROI from the product purchase, right? Well, ROI breaks down into benefits, and that can further break down into, it breaks down into benefits versus costs. On the benefits side of the pyramid, you may break that down into like, is this a product that's going to help me grow top line revenue or retain existing customers and help upsell? Or is it going to be more like, it's going to help me cut costs by making my employees more productive and those types of things? And then on the cost side, you think of like, obviously the direct cost of the SaaS subscription fees for your product, but also the indirect costs. How long is it going to take me to implement this new product at my company? How long do I have to use to train my employees and things like that to like get value out of it and those things? And so the reason we created the pyramid structure was sort of a few reasons, really. Number one, as we talked about, to separate the leading indicators from the lagging indicators. So at the top is the key outcome. Most likely it's a lagging indicator. At the bottom are the leading indicators. And this is where the product team can put their product KPIs and connect the dots between feature usage or logins and value creation for the customer, right? And so the other thing that the pyramid forces you to do is identify the relationship between all your different KPIs. I've seen like thousands of, not thousands, like a lot of SaaS dashboards where there'll be 22 metrics on the screen, and all of them look like they're moving in different directions. And it's like, I don't even know which one to focus on. So the pyramid structure also forces you to create that relationship. And the last thing, that the reason we sort of like recommend it is, it forces you to, it kind of helps minimize the number of KPIs you have to track. And I think people lose sight of the word key in KPIs. And the reality is, I haven't done the analysis, but imagine that it takes like 20 hours a month to like compile, analyze, report, communicate on every single KPI you're measuring in your product. that's a lot of time. I don't really want to have 50 when only 4 of them matter. And so I think the pyramid structure really forces you to think about what are the most important metrics for us to track, because it is a costly kind of exercise to track metrics.
Excellent. Thank you. That was helpful, Rajesh. So I'll go back to vision, because of course vision is where you start. It's the origin, but it then translates into strategy and then execution, isn't it? So first of all, we talked about vision a bit, but what makes for a compelling vision, and then how do you translate that into a successful strategy? Maybe if you could shed some light there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in on this one. So I think that in terms of creating a compelling vision, there's a few things that I would pay attention to here. I think the first one is that it has to be customer centric. I think, if you think about the customer KPIs that Rajesh was just describing, you really want to ground this in what the customer's experience is going to be. Again, a vision is not saying we're going to get to X millions of dollars in revenue. That's the side effect of you doing a great job with your customers. So you want the vision to be grounded in the customers. And the best way to do that is by explaining what the comprehensive journey will be for customers. And I think that this is where some companies kind of get it wrong. Like they think about what's going to drive engagement, where does the value come from for the customer? And those things are critically important. There's no doubt. But you also have to think about the endpoints of the customer journey as well. So like at the very end of their customer journey, what makes it so that they decide to come back to you? What makes them decide to pay for your product again the next time? What kind of metrics are they sort of like looking for at that time? But most importantly is actually the beginning of the customer journey, where I think it's like a step that gets skipped over. And if you think about like the jobs to be done framework or any other kind of framework on this, it's like they have an existing solution today. Why is somebody going to adopt your solution instead, right? Like, what's the thing that's going to trigger them to decide that their existing solution is no longer good enough? What's going to make them discover that your product even exists? And so that's where you sort of think about like the way that a growth team would work, or, Ravi, you had mentioned product-led growth earlier. I think that that's where the intersection of the product strategy and the product kind of like vision is with marketing. And that's where the intersection is in terms of thinking about how you can use viral growth to both create a trigger event and to also get people to discover your product simultaneously, right? So the more you sort of think about all the elements of the customer journey and all the steps that a customer needs to take to be successful in sort of discovering and actually using your product, the more believable I think the journey actually is, versus just sort of saying, well, we're going to have this thing over here, and I don't really know how they're connected. It's almost like recounting a dream. When you wake up, it seems like it all makes sense in your head. It's not until you try to describe that to somebody else that you realize how full of holes the whole thing actually is. And I think the same thing happens, with vision a lot. And so to make it a really compelling one and an accurate one, you've got to make sure that you actually, document it and get it all together. The way that you document it and the way that you share that with people matters as well. And I've personally made the mistake of creating really lengthy kind of like, vision documents that go into the details of everything, why we're going to be better than competitors. And it gets into, things like what the pricing strategy will be and things like that. And those things are all, important elements of sort of like the strategy for how you go about, realizing that vision. But it's often like too much detail. And I think that what people really remember and what they understand is stories. And so we actually recommend that people document their vision in a really compelling kind of narrative story format. Two of those that I'll share with you here that I think are really interesting. One of them is like doing it as a journal entry, like a diary that a customer writes 3 years in the future. So it's like, hey, it's Jane, it's 2023, January 1st. Here was my experience today. And, it kind of forces you to think from a customer's lens and to describe things, not just the actual interactions that they had, like I clicked on this button, nobody would ever write that, but they would describe their feelings. They would describe their anxieties. They would describe the things that made them, proud of the work that they were doing. They would describe the results that they got from your product. And so I think it's kind of like a nice forcing function for that. And the other one that we really like is like a really short kind of comic book concept for describing the customer journey from end to end in the format of like a comic book with like fun pictures and short captions and things like that. And it's kind of a really easy way for people to kind of understand what it is that we're trying to create, where the focus ends up being on the things that matter And a lot of the details where you need to have that kind of like more agile approach and that sort of, validation along the way, et cetera, where you don't know the answers, are exactly those things that you don't necessarily share as part of the vision. So that's kind of like the vision front of it. And the strategy side, we kind of think of it this way. Vision is like planting a flag in the future at point B. And if you're at point A today, that's great. But you got to work backwards to some degree. It's almost like solving a maze in reverse, where you sort of say, well, what is it going to take? What is the milestone we need to get to that will put us in a position to then realize that vision? Okay, well, what's the milestone we need to reach to before we get there? And you keep asking that question until you get back to today. And I think that it really helps to understand what the critical delivery elements actually are for realizing that vision. And if you can be really good at articulating what those key milestones are, then you have something that you can rally everybody behind, and they're very tangible and they're measurable outcomes along the way. Now, the important part about strategy, and the thing that I think is the thing that can get in the way, is strategy is where your kind of theoretical, idealistic, vision becomes much more real. And so you have to deal with the real world as you go through. And there's several things that we sort of recommend that people include in this, but depending on your company, there might be 7th or 8th ones as well. So one of them is like the financial situation and fundraising, right? You don't get to invest an infinite amount of money to go make that happen. You're going to have to show progress along the way to get additional funding, whether that's internal funding or external funding from VCs, et cetera. Like, that's the thing you absolutely need to consider. And, these are sort of the sort of like landmines that you have to avoid along the way, would be making all the progress in the world towards this, but having nothing to show for it and having your funding cut off. That's not going to work. So you think about that, you got to think about the realities of your competitive landscape. You've got to think about, are you trying to go after a really broad market, and can you break that market down and kind of go after a smaller market initially and then sort of extend from there? The same thing might be true with the outcomes. If you map out what that customer outcome pyramid is, maybe you focus on just one major component of that initially, and then you sort of extend to other parts later. You can think about data and technology dependencies, and you can also think about strategic levers that maybe you can create. So sometimes you get like a first mover advantage, right? Or you can build like a data lake that allows you to, create moats that somebody else can't really cross from a competitive standpoint. Or maybe there are partnerships that are worth kind of like, building up right now that give you access to channels that nobody else would have, et cetera. So thinking about how you might sort of like leverage those things to then put yourself in a position to be better, able to realize that vision in the first place. So those are the two parts of like kind of vision and strategy.
Thank you. That was very elaborate. When you began with vision, you said that it is grounded with your customer, right? Because the customer should the potential to solve customer problems should define your vision. However, maybe some light on what is the customer, because customer is this could be a market, right? It could be a segment, it could be a geographical. Say, what is the total addressable market? Usually, that's where they start the conversation for vision. So maybe you can shed some light on how do you define a customer and a market.
Yeah, I'll take that real quick as well. So the definition of the customer in the market is sometimes relatively easy, but for a lot of companies can actually be quite challenging. I'll take an example from my own experience when I was at eBay. Are the customers the buyers, or are the customers the sellers, right? It's kind of like both to some extent. And a lot of marketplace solutions, B2B, to C companies, et cetera, all kind of struggle with this definition of who their target customer is. And the reality is it's actually both. Like, you're going to be, if you fail to deliver results to one stakeholder or one party or the other, then the reality is you'll lose your ability to deliver results to the other. So you have to have kind of like, both to some extent. And I usually try to, encourage people to have a wide sort of cast net over what their target market is from that front. That said, I would say that in general, what we found to be most successful as an area to focus when thinking about your target market, when there's multiple different types of customers at play, is to think about the demand side of the equation. And if you can sort of focus on making sure that there's always demand for the usage of your platform or your product, that's something that's really important to do. And I'll give you an example, from eBay, which is we could have focused a lot of attention on sellers And had we done that, you can make it very efficient to list as many items on eBay as possible, and you can make it so that the descriptions of those items are really easily done, and so that the amount of time that a seller has to spend is really minimized, etc. But at the end of the day, those sellers aren't going to care about any of those things unless there are buyers there to actually buy their products, right? And in a lot of ways, if you can just make it so that when people want to buy items, if they were typing in ebay.com into their browser instead of amazon.com into their browser, by creating a more compelling and a better buying experience, sellers will figure out the things that they need to do to go meet that demand. In reality, supply finds a way to reach demand, but demand has no particular sort of like reason to show up because there's supply there. It's not like if you build it, they will come. You've got to find a reason for people to come, and then people will kind of like help you build it, to some extent. And so that's kind of like, I think, a lesson that's learned from some of these more complex businesses where there's multiple kinds of customers. But that would be my kind of take on that.
Thank you, Ben. So we have the last question. I think we're doing good with time. We have 5 more minutes, good enough time for finishing off with the last question. I think Rajesh was the one who briefly mentioned about balanced roadmap. Maybe we could elaborate on that. What does the balanced roadmap mean in the state between innovation, operation, and iteration?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so like kind of, earlier we talked about the vision-led framework, and it's great to have a vision and a strategy. And sometimes I literally see both of those artifacts sit on the shelf collecting dust, and everyone nods their head and says, yeah, that'd be cool if we did that. Let's get back to whatever we were working on, right? And so the reason we create the framework is to make sure that when the rubber needs to hit the road, that the team has allocated the right amount of time to actually realize the vision. And so we realized, as we were thinking about all of our experience and watching our clients kind of operate, there's kind of 3 main categories that are always happening that kind of go onto product roadmaps, right? We called it innovation, iteration, and operation. So innovation is progress towards that vision. Hopefully the vision is exciting and groundbreaking, so you would consider all the time you spent on that innovation. And so that's sort of one work stream. Then there's iteration, which is like, hey, I have existing customers and users, and there's feedback from internal stakeholders, and like I can't just ignore all of that. And so iteration is like modest tweaks, A/B testing, conversion funnel optimizations, those types of things. And so that's like kind of a second work stream. Then the third is what we called operation, which is really the cost of having a modern SaaS platform, performance, security, uptime, cloud migrations, like internal tooling, maybe some bugs fall into this bucket. And the reason we, articulate these 3 categories is that often we see teams struggle in prioritizing like a bug against a new feature against like some tech debt. And it's like, it's apples and oranges. You really can't prioritize those things against each other. If you first categorize those things, then prioritization becomes a little bit easier. The other thing we really recommend for teams is that if you were going to think about those 3 categories, rather than just, start thinking about what would fall into each one, instead do a top-down allocation first. So make the really hard choice first of like, as the leadership team, what percentage of our overall product development capacity over the next call it 18 months or 3 years or whatever should go towards innovation? How much are we willing to invest to make this vision a reality? How much should we go into iteration, and how much should go into operation? And I think the reality is, in the book, we have some rules of thumb. It really depends on the product lifecycle stage, right? So early on, you haven't launched a product, it's all about the vision, right? All you're doing is trying to make this vision a reality. But as soon as you launch it, you probably spend a lot of your time on iteration. You're trying to make sure that those first customers and users are really successful, and you're trying to understand about their needs by iterating on some of their feedback, or listening to the feedback at least. And then as you start to find that product market fit, now scale becomes a major concern, right? Oh shoot, like the platform can't handle this many users, and like we've got like all this database optimization that needs to happen and like stuff. So now operation probably starts to become a big bucket. And we also think about the life cycle of a product, which is like when you have a mature product, you're probably spending most of your time on sort of like iteration, or an operation is probably where it is. You don't want to stagnate in the way that you're delivering value to your customers. And so as you get to a plateau of value delivery to your customers, that's actually the time you need to start thinking about the next wave of innovation. And so we use kind of the S curves of innovation, like visualization, to say like, you constantly need to be thinking about the next chapter of how you deliver more value for your customers. And I think, you've heard us talk a lot about the customer value. There's an analogy we kind of use in the book that I think is really good, which is like, a lot of teams are just trying to, if you think of like your customers as like a sponge, they're just trying to squeeze as much water out of the sponge as possible to generate, like optimize the revenue. And at some point, though, the sponge is going to be dry, right? And so rather than like just trying to figure out how to get all the water out of the sponge, what you really should be thinking about is how do I make sure that the sponge is always wet, and right, how do I re-wet the sponge as we're sort of extracting value? And so, that's sort of the core concept in capturing customer value.
Got it. Thank you. Well, this brings us to the end of our insightful conversation with both Rajesh and Ben. I think all the listeners who are listening, they should buy the book, Build What Matters. We have barely scraped the surface. I think we have only touched 10% of the book. There is a lot in the book. I am also looking forward to finish the book this weekend. And so with that, Rajesh and Ben, thanks for your time. It was fun talking to you.
It was great talking to you as well. Thanks so much for the time.
Yeah, Ravi, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you.